The autumn of 1995 carried an unusual chill through the streets of Portland, Oregon. The city bustled with its typical rhythm, coffee shops filled with grunge music enthusiasts, the Willamette River reflecting grey October skies, and families preparing for Halloween. Among them was Marcus Reeves, a 34-year-old accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, a man so ordinary that his disappearance would haunt investigators for nearly 3 decades. Marcus lived in a modest craftsman house in the Selwood neighborhood with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children, 7-year-old Daniel and 4-year-old Emma. Colleagues described him as meticulous, the kind of man who color-coded his files and never missed a deadline. His neighbors knew him as the friendly father who coached Little League on weekends and maintained the neatest lawn on the block. On October 18, 1995, Marcus left for work at his usual time, 7:30 a.m., kissing Jennifer goodbye and promising to pick up milk on his way home. His burgundy Honda Accord pulled out of the driveway as it had 1,000 times before. But Marcus Reeves never came home that night. He never picked up the milk. He simply vanished. If you're captivated by this mystery, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from viewers around the world who share our fascination with these unsolved cases. Jennifer initially assumed he'd been caught up at work. Marcus had mentioned an upcoming audit that had everyone stressed. But when 8 p.m. passed, then 9 p.m., her concern deepened. She called his office. No answer. She called his closest colleague, Robert Chen. Robert hadn't seen Marcus since their morning meeting at 9 a.m. By midnight, Jennifer contacted the Portland Police Bureau. The officer who took her call was sympathetic, but explained that adults have the right to leave, that most missing persons cases resolve within 48 hours. Still, they filed a report. Detective Linda Hartman was assigned to the case the following morning. What Detective Hartman discovered troubled her immediately. Marcus's car was found 3 days later in a parking lot near Forest Park, one of the largest urban forests in the United States. The vehicle was locked, keys missing, with Marcus's briefcase still on the passenger seat. Inside the briefcase, his wallet, containing $237 in cash, credit cards, and his driver's license. His appointment book showed nothing unusual scheduled for that day. The initial investigation uncovered no signs of foul play, no evidence of suicide, no indication Marcus had planned to disappear. His bank accounts remained untouched, no withdrawals, no suspicious transactions. His life insurance policy was modest, offering no financial motive. Jennifer passed a polygraph examination. Co-workers were interviewed extensively. Nothing seemed amiss. Forest Park became the focus of extensive searches. Volunteers combed through dense Douglas fir forests, following trails that wound through 200 acres of wilderness. Search and rescue teams brought dogs. Helicopters scanned from above. Nothing. It was as if Marcus had stepped out of his car and dissolved into the Oregon mist. Weeks turned into months. Jennifer held vigils, distributed flyers throughout Portland's neighborhoods, appeared on local news programs pleading for information. Daniel, trying to be brave, asked his mother every night when Daddy would come home. Emma, too young to fully comprehend, kept Marcus's reading glasses on her nightstand, waiting. Detective Hartman pursued every lead. Anonymous tips flooded in. Someone thought they'd seen Marcus at a truck stop in Idaho. Another claimed he'd moved to California. All proved false. The case grew cold as winter settled over Portland, then colder still as years accumulated like layers of sediment, burying the truth deeper. In 1997, Jennifer filed for a declaration of presumed death. The legal process felt like abandoning Marcus all over again, but she needed closure for the children, for their future. The court granted it. Life moved forward in that painful, limping way it does after tragedy. Daniel grew into a teenager, carrying his father's disappearance like an invisible weight. Emma learned who Marcus was through photographs and stories. A ghost father she couldn't quite remember. Detective Hartman retired in 2004, but Marcus's case file sat in her home office. She'd review it occasionally, convinced she'd missed something. Other detectives came and went. The case was officially cold, filed away in the basement archives of the Portland Police Bureau, one folder among thousands of unsolved mysteries. Jennifer eventually remarried in 2003 to a kind man named Thomas, who understood that part of her heart remained with Marcus, trapped in that October day when everything changed. Daniel became a software engineer, Emma a social worker. Both carried their father's disappearance differently. Daniel through obsessive research into missing persons cases, Emma through helping families in crisis. The breakthrough came in an entirely unexpected way. In April 2023, Detective Raymond Park, a cold case specialist with the Portland Police Bureau, was conducting a systematic review of unsolved disappearances from the 1990s. New DNA technology had revolutionized forensic investigation, offering possibilities that didn't exist when Marcus vanished. Detective Park believed old cases deserved fresh eyes and modern science. He pulled Marcus's file, now brittle with age, and began cataloging every piece of physical evidence retained from the investigation. Most items were unremarkable. Documents, photographs, clothing recovered from Marcus's abandoned car. But then Detective Park found something peculiar, an envelope containing a letter. The letter had been discovered in Marcus's desk at work 3 weeks after his disappearance. It was addressed to Jennifer, but never mailed, dated October 17, 1995, the day before Marcus vanished. The letter was brief, almost cryptic. Jennifer, I need you to know that everything I've done has been to protect our family. Some debts can never be fully paid. I'm sorry for what's coming. Tell the kids I love them. MBU, at the time, investigators had analyzed the letter for handwriting, confirmed to be Marcus's, and for content which suggested he might have planned to leave or anticipated danger, but the letter yielded no concrete leads. It was bagged and filed away. Detective Park decided to have the envelope and letter re-examined using advanced DNA phenotyping and genealogical techniques that had recently solved numerous cold cases. The lab extracted DNA from the envelope's seal, saliva from when Marcus had licked it closed, and from a small, previously unnoticed stain on the corner of the letter itself. Marcus's DNA profile was already on file from personal items. But the stain revealed something unexpected, a second DNA profile. The sample was sent to a genetic genealogy company that compared it against public DNA databases, building family trees to identify potential matches. 6 weeks later, Detective Park received results that transformed the entire investigation. The secondary DNA belonged to a man named Victor Maldonado, who had died in a car accident in Nevada in 2007. Victor had no prior criminal record in Oregon, but deeper investigation revealed his connection to Marcus's past, a connection that had been completely overlooked in the original investigation. Detective Park began reconstructing Victor's history. In the early 1990s, Victor had been involved with a small-time loan operation in Portland that federal investigators later determined had ties to organized crime. The operation had been shut down in 1994, with several associates arrested. Victor had avoided prosecution by disappearing before indictments were filed. Detective Park's team discovered financial records showing that Marcus had borrowed $35,000 from Victor's operation in 1993, during a period when Jennifer was undergoing expensive medical treatment for a pregnancy complication. Marcus had kept this entirely secret from his wife, making payments quietly, draining their savings while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. By 1995, Marcus still owed approximately $18,000, but Victor's operation no longer existed in its official capacity. The loan had been sold, passed between various parties in Portland's criminal underground. Interest had compounded. The debt had grown to nearly $50,000, an impossible sum for an accountant with a modest salary. Phone records from 1995, pulled from archived files, showed that Marcus had received 3 calls from a payphone near Southeast Powell Boulevard in the weeks before his disappearance. Detective Park tracked down a retired detective who remembered that payphone as being frequently used by associates of the now-defunct loan operation. The letter made horrifying sense now. Marcus hadn't been planning to abandon his family. He'd been trying to warn Jennifer without fully explaining the danger he was in. But what had actually happened to Marcus? Detective Park knew DNA on the letter proved Victor had been in contact with Marcus shortly before the disappearance, but Victor was dead. The trail seemed to end there until Detective Park employed a technique that was becoming increasingly powerful in cold case investigations: social network analysis. He mapped out everyone connected to Victor Maldonado in 1995. One name appeared repeatedly: Vincent Castellano, Victor's cousin, who had served prison time in the early 2000s for assault and racketeering. Vincent was still alive, living in Bend, Oregon, now 63 years old. Detective Park obtained a warrant and brought Vincent in for questioning. Vincent initially denied everything, but when presented with evidence linking him to Victor, to the loan operation, and to several individuals who remembered seeing Vincent and Victor together in 1995, his resolve cracked. Vincent requested an attorney and, after days of negotiation, agreed to provide information in exchange for consideration on potential charges. What Vincent revealed was tragic and brutal. On October 18, 1995, Victor had arranged to meet Marcus at Forest Park. The meeting was meant to be a final confrontation about the debt. Victor wanted his money. Marcus had none to give. According to Vincent, who claimed he was present but not the primary actor, the situation escalated quickly. Marcus had apparently tried to negotiate, explaining that he could never pay the inflated amount, that he had a family, that he'd been trying to make payments. Victor, facing his own pressures from people higher up in the criminal network, had lost his temper. A physical altercation ensued. Vincent's account was chilling in its matter-of-fact delivery. Marcus had been struck, had fallen, hitting his head on a rock near one of the forest trails. Whether it was intentional murder or a tragic accident in the heat of confrontation remained unclear. Vincent maintained it wasn't planned, but that Marcus had died there, in the forest, on that grey October afternoon. Victor and Vincent had panicked. They'd hidden Marcus's body deep in Forest Park, in an area far from any marked trail, then abandoned his car in the parking lot to make it appear he'd entered the forest alone. Detective Park immediately organized a search based on Vincent's directions. The area he described had changed significantly in 28 years. Trees had grown, trails had shifted, landslides had altered the terrain. But with Vincent's cooperation and ground-penetrating radar technology, the search team identified an anomaly. In early June 2023, excavation began. 3 feet down, wrapped in deteriorated plastic sheeting and partially integrated with the forest floor, investigators found skeletal remains. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. They'd found Marcus Reeves. Jennifer, now 65, received the phone call she'd been waiting for and dreading for 28 years. Detective Park delivered the news in person, sitting in her living room while Thomas held her hand. Daniel and Emma drove in from their respective cities, the family reuniting around the truth they'd finally found. The medical examiner determined that Marcus had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with Vincent's account. Whether it was murder or manslaughter would be for courts to decide, but for the Reeves family, The legal distinctions mattered less than simply knowing what had happened to their husband, their father. Vincent Castellano was charged with manslaughter and concealment of a corpse. At his age, with his prior record, he faced significant prison time. Victor, dead for 16 years, escaped earthly justice, though his DNA, preserved on a letter Marcus had written to say goodbye, had ultimately betrayed his crime. In August 2023, Marcus Reeves was finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by family, friends, and even some of the original investigators who'd never forgotten his case. Detective Hartman, now 82 years old, attended in her wheelchair, tears streaming down her weathered face. She'd known something was wrong, had sensed it in her bones all those years ago, and now, at last, Marcus could rest. Jennifer spoke at the funeral, her voice steady despite the emotion. For 28 years, we lived in limbo, not knowing if Marcus had chosen to leave us or if something terrible had happened. Today, we have our answer. It's not the answer we wanted, but it's truth, and truth allows us to heal. Marcus was a good man who made one mistake, borrowing money to save our family, and that mistake cost him everything. He tried to protect us until the very end. Daniel, now 35, stood beside his mother, his arm around her shoulders. He'd spent years researching, hoping, and now he could finally stop searching. Emma, 32, held her own daughter, Marcus's granddaughter, who bore his middle name, Elizabeth. 3 generations stood there, connected by love and loss, and finally, resolution. Detective Park received commendations for his work, but he deflected praise. The DNA told the story, he said in interviews. Marcus left us a message in that letter, not just in words, but in the very molecules of his DNA. Science gave us the tools to listen. All I did was pay attention. The case became a teaching example in forensic science programs and cold case investigation courses. That a letter written the day before a man disappeared, sealed in an envelope and filed away for nearly 3 decades, could ultimately solve his murder seemed almost poetic. The touch of 2 men, victim and perpetrator, preserved on paper, waiting for technology to catch up with truth. In the months following Marcus's funeral, Jennifer began volunteering with a non-profit organization that supported families of missing persons. She understood their limbo, their desperate hope mixed with terrible fear. She could offer them something precious. The testimony that answers, however painful, were better than endless uncertainty. Daniel created a website documenting his father's case, not as a tragedy, but as a testament to persistence and the power of modern forensics. He corresponded with Detective Park regularly, discussing other cold cases, offering the perspective of a victim's family member. His father's disappearance had defined much of his life. Now he was determined to give that pain purpose. Emma incorporated her father's story into her work with at-risk families, helping people understand how secrets and shame, like Marcus's hidden debt, could spiral into catastrophe. She taught financial literacy courses, emphasizing the importance of communication and seeking help before problems became insurmountable. The case raised broader questions about the loan shark operations that had flourished in Portland during the 1980s and 1990s. Investigations were reopened into several other unsolved disappearances from that era, with investigators wondering how many other Marcus Reeveses had vanished because of debts and desperation. 2 additional cases were solved within the following year, their bodies recovered, their families finally able to grieve properly. Vincent Castellano was convicted in March 2024 of voluntary manslaughter and received a 20-year sentence. During his sentencing, he read a brief statement. "I can't undo what happened, Marcus Reeves was a good man stuck in a bad situation. I was young and stupid, following Victor, not thinking about the family left behind. I'm sorry, doesn't cover it, but it's all I have. Jennifer attended the sentencing but didn't speak. Afterward, reporters asked if she felt justice had been served. She considered the question carefully. My husband has been gone for 28 years. Vincent going to prison doesn't bring him back. But knowing what happened, knowing Marcus didn't abandon us, knowing he was thinking of us until the end, that's what mattered most. The rest is just legal procedure. The story of Marcus Reeves's disappearance and eventual discovery resonated far beyond Portland. It became a symbol of how far forensic science had advanced, how cold cases that once seemed impossible to solve were yielding to new techniques. DNA databases, genealogical research, and advanced forensic methods were rewriting the book on criminal investigation. But for those who loved Marcus, the science was secondary to the closure. Daniel kept a photograph of his father on his desk. Marcus, in his early 30s, before the debt, before the fear, smiling at a family barbecue. Emma named her second child Marcus, ensuring her father's name would continue through generations. On October 18, 2024, the 29th anniversary of Marcus's disappearance, Jennifer, Daniel, Emma, and their families hiked into Forest Park. They found the area where Marcus had been recovered, now marked only by memory and GPS coordinates. They stood together in the Douglas fir forest, sunlight filtering through the canopy, and spoke about Marcus, not about his death, but about his life. They told stories of his terrible jokes, his patient homework help, his Saturday morning pancakes. They laughed and cried, and remembered the man he'd been before fear and debt and violence took him away. In that moment, surrounded by the forest that had held him for so long, Marcus felt present in a way he hadn't since 1995. Jennifer placed flowers where he'd been found, not in mourning, but in acknowledgement. Marcus had been trapped in this forest, in the darkness of secrets and violence, for 28 years. Now he was free, and so was his family. As they hiked back toward civilization, Thomas walked beside Jennifer, giving her space to process alone together. Daniel and Emma followed with their families, their children asking questions about the grandfather they were learning to know through stories. The case of Marcus Reeves, the man who went missing in 1995 and whose fate was finally revealed by DNA from an old letter 28 years later, entered the archives as solved. But for the Reeves family, it was more than a closed case. It was the end of a long, painful chapter and the beginning of something new: peace. Detective Park continued working cold cases, each file representing a family in limbo, waiting for answers that might never come. But Marcus's case reminded him why the work mattered. Science and determination could reach across decades to deliver truth. Sometimes that truth was terrible, but it was always better than silence. In the end, Marcus Reeves was remembered not for how he died, but for how he lived. As a father who loved his children, a husband who tried to protect his family, a man who made one desperate choice that cost him everything. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of predatory lending, the importance of seeking help, and the devastating consequences of secrets. But it also became a testament to love's endurance. Jennifer never stopped looking. Daniel never stopped hoping. Emma never stopped remembering. And when science finally revealed what had happened in that forest 3 decades ago, they were ready to face it together. Marcus Reeves came home at last, carried by DNA, delivered by justice, embraced by a family that had never let him go. The years following Marcus's burial brought unexpected developments that would further illuminate the darker corners of his story and Portland's criminal underworld of the 1990s. In November 2024, Detective Park received a letter from an inmate at the Oregon State Penitentiary. The sender was Gerald Hutchins, a 68-year-old man serving time for racketeering and money laundering. Hutchins had read about Vincent Castellanos' conviction in the prison newspaper and claimed to have information about the loan operation that had ensnared Marcus Reeves. Detective Park visited Hutchins on a cold morning when rain drummed against the prison windows. Hutchins was gaunt, his hands trembling slightly as he sat across from the detective in the sterile visiting room. He explained that he'd been one of the financiers behind the loan operation, working primarily from Seattle, but with connections throughout the Pacific Northwest. Victor Maldonado was small-time, Hutchins said, his voice raspy from decades of smoking. But he was connected to people who weren't. When his operation got shut down in '94, a lot of debts got transferred to a guy named Anthony Ricci. Tony ran things differently, more aggressive, more violent. He didn't care about your sob story or your family. You paid or you suffered consequences. Detective Park leaned forward. Are you saying Ricci ordered the hit on Marcus Reeves? Hutchins shook his head. I'm saying Tony put pressure on Victor to collect. Told him if he couldn't get the money, he'd have to pay it himself with interest. Victor was desperate. He probably went to that forest planning to scare Marcus, maybe rough him up enough to make him find the money somehow. But things went wrong, like they always do when amateurs try to play enforcer. This revelation opened another investigative pathway. Anthony Ricci had been convicted of racketeering in 1998 and served 15 years before being released in 2013. He now lived in Tacoma, Washington, operating what appeared to be a legitimate used car dealership. Detective Park coordinated with Washington authorities to bring Ricci in for questioning. Ricci, now 71, arrived with an expensive attorney and an air of annoyed cooperation. He acknowledged knowing Victor Maldonado, but denied any involvement in Marcus's death. His attorney reminded everyone that Ricci had served his time and that any allegations from nearly 30 years ago would be difficult to prove. However, financial records subpoenaed from Ricci's old operations revealed something disturbing. Marcus Reeves hadn't been the only one. Between 1993 and 1995, at least 17 people in Portland had borrowed from the network Ricci controlled. Of those 17, 3 others had disappeared without a trace during the same period. Detective Park assembled a task force. The 3 cases, Ronald Baker disappeared March 1994, Lisa Thompson disappeared August 1994, James O'Brien disappeared January 1995, had all been investigated independently, with no connection established between them. Now, armed with the knowledge of their shared connection to Ricci's loan network, investigators began re-examining each case with fresh perspective. The Baker family was contacted first. Ronald's sister Patricia, now 64, broke down when Detective Park explained the potential connection. Ronnie was desperate, she said through tears. His business failed. He had medical bills from his son's leukemia treatment. He wouldn't tell us where he got the money, just that he'd handled it. Then one day he left for work and never came back. We thought maybe he'd run away from the shame, from the debt. We never imagined. Lisa Thompson's mother had passed away in 2010, never knowing what happened to her daughter, but Lisa's brother, Marcus, coincidentally sharing the same name as Marcus Reeves, remembered his sister's anxiety in the months before she vanished. She was terrified of someone, wouldn't say who. She worked double shifts at the diner, trying to pay off something. She told me once that she'd made a mistake that was going to destroy her life. 3 weeks later, she was gone. James O'Brien's wife had remarried and moved to California, but their daughter, Kathleen, still lived in Portland. She was only 8 when her father disappeared. Dad was a gambler, she explained to Detective Park. Not casinos, poker games, sports betting, stuff like that. Mom said he owed people money. The police investigated but found nothing. Mom eventually told me Dad probably started a new life somewhere, that he'd abandoned us. I believed that for 30 years. The task force began the painstaking work of searching for these three individuals. Unlike Marcus's case, there were no letters with DNA evidence, no cooperative witnesses willing to confess. They had only financial records, testimony from aging witnesses, and the advanced forensic techniques that had evolved over the decades. Ground-penetrating radar teams surveyed areas of Forest Park that had never been thoroughly examined in the 1990s. The park's vast expanse, more than 5,000 acres, meant that countless locations could conceal remains. Additionally, investigators looked at other sites, construction areas from the mid-1990s that had since been developed, the Columbia River shoreline, abandoned properties in industrial southeast Portland. Jennifer followed these developments with complicated emotions. Learning that Marcus hadn't been alone, that others had suffered the same fate, somehow made his death both more tragic and less isolating. She reached out to Patricia Baker, and the two women met for coffee at a small shop in northeast Portland. They sat across from each other, two women bound by loss and unanswered questions spanning decades. Patricia clutched a photograph of her brother, a smiling man in his 40s with kind eyes. Jennifer recognized something in Patricia's expression, the weight of not knowing, now mixed with the terrible hope of finally learning the truth. "Do you think they'll find him?" Patricia asked. Jennifer chose her words carefully. "They found Marcus after 28 years. The science now, the technology, it's remarkable what they can do. But more than that, Detective Park cares. He won't stop until he has answers for you." Over the following months, the two families, Baker and Thompson, joined by Kathleen O'Brien, formed an unlikely support network. They met regularly, sharing memories of their lost loved ones, discussing the investigation's progress, supporting each other through the emotional turbulence of hope and grief reopened. Daniel Reeves, using his technology background, created a digital database compiling everything known about the lone operation and its victims. He cross-referenced locations, dates, known associates, and financial transactions. His work revealed patterns that even experienced investigators had missed, specific neighborhoods where victims lived, particular banks they used, common intermediaries who'd connected them to the loan network. This database proved invaluable when in March 2025, construction workers breaking ground for a new apartment complex in southeast Portland's industrial district uncovered human remains. The site had been a vacant lot in the 1990s, owned by a shell corporation that investigators eventually traced back to associates of Anthony Ricci. The remains were heavily degraded, but forensic anthropologists determined they belonged to a male, approximately 40-50 years old at time of death, deceased for roughly 20 to 30 years. Dental records and DNA analysis took weeks, but finally provided confirmation. Ronald Baker had been found. Patricia received the news while at work, stepping out of a meeting to take Detective Park's call. She sank into a chair in the hallway, holding the phone to her ear, listening as the detective gently explained that her brother's remains had been identified, that his death appeared to have resulted from gunshot wounds to the chest, that he'd likely died quickly. "He's been under a parking lot for 30 years, Patricia whispered. "People walking over him, cars parking on top of him, and none of us knew he was so close." Ronald's funeral took place on a rainy April morning. Jennifer, Daniel, and Emma attended, standing with Patricia and her family as Ronald was finally laid to rest beside his parents. The minister spoke about mercy and justice delayed but not denied. Patricia read a letter she'd written to her brother, telling him about his son, now a grown man with children of his own, telling him he was missed, that he was loved, that he could rest now. The discovery of Ronald's remains intensified pressure on Anthony Ricci. While direct evidence linking him to the murder remained elusive, the pattern was undeniable. Financial records showed that Ronald, like Marcus, had owed money to Ricci's network. Victor Maldonado and Vincent Castellano had worked for Ricci. The body had been found on property connected to Ricci's associates. Federal prosecutors became involved, examining whether RICO statutes could be applied despite the passage of time. Ricci's attorney fought vigorously, arguing that his client had already served time for his racketeering activities, that double jeopardy applied, that the evidence was circumstantial. Meanwhile, the search for Lisa Thompson and James O'Brien continued. Detective Park's team investigated a tip about a remote property in the Columbia River Gorge that had been used by Ricci's associates in the 1990s. Cadaver dogs indicated possible remains, and excavation began in May 2025. The gorge location was hauntingly beautiful. Steep hillsides covered in Douglas fir and Oregon white oak, views of the river cutting through basalt cliffs. It seemed impossible that something so terrible could have occurred in such a serene setting, yet investigators had learned that evil often chose beautiful places to hide its crimes. 2 weeks into the excavation, workers uncovered a shallow grave containing 2 sets of remains. Forensic analysis revealed one set belonged to a female, the other to a male, both consistent with the age and physical descriptions of Lisa Thompson and James O'Brien. DNA confirmation would take additional time, but investigators were confident. Lisa's brother Marcus broke down when Detective Park shared the preliminary findings. 31 years, he said. 31 years of wondering, of hoping she was alive somewhere. Maybe happy, maybe just too ashamed to come home. And she's been in the ground the whole time, 90 minutes from where we lived. Kathleen O'Brien's reaction was quieter but no less profound. She sat in Detective Park's office, staring at the photograph of the excavation site, and finally asked the question that had haunted her since childhood. Did my father abandon us, or was he taken from us? He was taken, Detective Park said gently. Nothing we've found suggests he wanted to leave. He was trapped by debt and killed by people who valued money over human life. That's not the same as choosing to abandon your family. Kathleen nodded slowly, processing this reframing of her entire childhood narrative. The father she'd been taught to resent for leaving had actually been a victim. The anger she'd carried for decades suddenly had nowhere to go except toward the people who'd created this tragedy. By July 2025, DNA confirmation arrived. The remains were indeed Lisa Thompson and James O'Brien. Both had died from gunshot wounds. Both had been buried together in a location far enough from Portland to avoid casual discovery, but close enough for whoever killed them to access easily. Twin funerals were held, with the families supporting each other through the ceremonies. The missing persons community, families who'd lost loved ones to unsolved disappearances, attended in force, recognizing that each solved case represented hope for their own unresolved tragedies. Jennifer spoke at Lisa's funeral, though they'd never met. Lisa and Marcus, my Marcus, died in different ways in different places, but they shared the same fate. They were people who made desperate choices to help their families, and those choices led them to cross paths with people who had no mercy. We honor them by remembering they were more than how they died. They were brothers and sisters, parents and friends, people who loved and were loved. The investigation into Anthony Ricci culminated in August 2025, when Vincent Castellano, already serving 20 years for Marcus's death, agreed to testify against his former boss in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. Vincent provided detailed accounts of Ricci's operations, including orders to handle people who couldn't pay their debts. According to Vincent's testimony, Ronald Baker had been killed by a hitman Ricci had brought in from California, a professional who'd since died of cancer in 2015. Lisa Thompson and James O'Brien had been killed together. They'd known each other through the desperation of shared debt and had apparently confronted Ricci together, demanding more time to pay. That confrontation, Vincent testified, had signed their death warrants. Ricci was indicted on 3 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. His trial began in October 2025, the courtroom packed with family members of the victims, journalists, and legal observers interested in the intersection of cold case investigation and modern forensic science. The prosecution presented financial records, witness testimony, and the physical evidence of 3 bodies discovered in locations connected to Ricci's criminal network. The defense argued that Vincent Castellano was an unreliable witness seeking to reduce his own sentence, that the evidence was circumstantial, that 3 decades had passed and memories were unreliable. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Jennifer attended every day, sitting beside Patricia Baker, Marcus Thompson, and Kathleen O'Brien. They became a visible reminder to the jury of what was at stake, not abstract legal concepts, but real families who'd suffered real losses.